The legal situation was complicated by Julie's growing fame and the protection afforded by her connections to influential patrons of the arts. However, the severity of the charges and the scandal they created meant that she could not simply return to her normal life and career as if nothing had happened. She was sentenced to death in absentia, a judgment that could only be enforced if she were captured, but which effectively made her an outlaw who had to be constantly careful about where she went and whom she associated with. The death sentence, while terrifying in its implications, was also somewhat hollow given the complex political realities of 17th century France. Many crimes that theoretically carried capital punishment were rarely enforced to their fullest extent, particularly when the accused had powerful friends or possessed skills that were valued by influential people. Julie's situation was further complicated by the fact that her alleged victim, the young woman she had rescued, had not been physically harmed and had in fact participated willingly in the escape. The scandal surrounding the convent burning became a sensation throughout France, with the story being told and retold in increasingly dramatic versions that sometimes bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. Julie found herself transformed from a celebrated opera singer into a legendary figure whose exploits captured the popular imagination. Broadsheets and pamphlets recounting her adventures were sold in markets and taverns, often embellishing the facts with additional romantic and heroic details. The young woman she had rescued faced her own consequences from the escapade. Her family, humiliated by the public scandal and furious at what they saw as their daughter's complete moral corruption, disowned her entirely. She found herself cut off from her inheritance, expelled from respectable society, and forced to make her own way in a world that offered few opportunities for women without family support or independent means. Julie, despite her own legal difficulties, did what she could to help her former lover establish a new life. She used her connections in the theatrical world to find her work as a seamstress and costume maker for various opera companies, positions that provided modest but steady income and kept her within the relatively tolerant artistic community where unconventional behavior was more readily accepted. Their romantic relationship, however, could not survive the stress and trauma of their dramatic escape and its aftermath. The intensity of their shared adventure had been both exhilarating and exhausting, and both women found that they needed time and space to recover from the emotional and physical toll of their experiences. They remained friends and maintained contact throughout their lives, but the passionate love affair that had motivated such extraordinary risks gradually evolved into a more stable but less intense connection. The period following the convent burning was one of uncertainty and constant vigilance for Julie. She could not return to her previous life as a celebrated opera singer, at least not immediately, but neither could she disappear entirely from public view without losing the connections and opportunities that made her artistic career possible. She had to find ways to continue performing and developing her reputation while avoiding the attention of authorities who might be inclined to enforce the legal judgments against her. This situation required Julie to develop new skills in discretion and political maneuvering that had not been necessary during her earlier, more straightforward career. She learned to work through intermediaries, to perform in venues where her identity could be somewhat concealed, and to cultivate relationships with patrons who could provide protection from legal consequences while still allowing her to pursue her artistic ambitions. The enforced discretion of this period also gave Julie time to reflect on her goals and priorities in ways that her previously hectic lifestyle had not permitted. She began to think more strategically about her career, considering not just immediate opportunities but long-term prospects for artistic development and social advancement. The crisis had taught her that her talent alone, remarkable as it was, might not be sufficient to sustain her career if she continued to make enemies and create scandals. Yet she was not prepared to fundamentally change her nature or abandon the independence and authenticity that had always defined her character. Instead, she began to develop more sophisticated approaches to living according to her own values while managing the social and political consequences of her choices. She learned to pick her battles more carefully, to build alliances with people who could support her unconventional lifestyle, and to present her rebellious behavior in ways that seemed romantic and admirable rather than merely criminal or immoral. The convent burning scandal, despite its immediate negative consequences, ultimately enhanced Julie's reputation and mystique in ways that would benefit her throughout the rest of her career. She had demonstrated not just artistic talent, but genuine courage and devotion to love that resonated with audiences who were starved for authentic passion in their own highly constrained lives. The story of her dramatic rescue became part of her legend, adding an element of romantic heroism to her public persona that no amount of conventional publicity could have achieved. Word of her exploits spread beyond France to other European countries, where she became known as an example of what French women might achieve when freed from conventional constraints. Foreign visitors to France often sought opportunities to see her perform, curious about the legendary woman whose adventures had become the subject of songs, stories, and theatrical productions throughout Europe. This international recognition provided Julie with additional protection from domestic persecution, as taking action against someone who had become a symbol of French cultural achievement might have diplomatic implications that government officials preferred to avoid. Her growing fame made her increasingly valuable as a cultural ambassador, someone whose achievements reflected positively on French artistic and social sophistication. The scandal also established patterns of behavior and relationship that would characterize the rest of Julie's life. She had demonstrated that she was willing to take extraordinary risks for love, that she possessed the skills and courage necessary to rescue herself and others from seemingly impossible situations, and that she could not be controlled or contained by conventional social institutions. These qualities would attract both devoted admirers and dangerous enemies throughout her career. As the immediate crisis of the legal charges began to fade, thanks to the intervention of powerful patrons and the passage of time that allowed public attention to focus on other scandals, Julie began to plan her return to regular operatic performance. She had learned valuable lessons about discretion and political maneuvering, but she had not abandoned her fundamental commitment to living authentically and pursuing the kind of passionate experiences that gave her life meaning and purpose. The stage was set for the next phase of her career, one that would see her achieve her greatest artistic triumphs while continuing to navigate the complex social and political challenges that her unconventional lifestyle created. The convent burning scandal had established her as more than just a talented performer. She had become a genuine celebrity whose personal life was as fascinating to the public as her professional achievements. Tirasuern, Part 6. Triumph at the Paris Opera. Following the dramatic events at the convent, Julie d'Aubigny found herself in the paradoxical position of being both a wanted criminal and an increasingly celebrated artist. The scandal had made her name known throughout France, but rather than destroying her career, the notoriety seemed to enhance her appeal to audiences who were fascinated by her combination of artistic brilliance and dangerous reputation. It was during this period of exile and uncertainty that she received an invitation that would transform her from a provincial opera singer into one of the most celebrated performers of her generation. The Académie Royale de Musique, known simply as the Paris Opera, was the pinnacle of French musical culture, the institution where the greatest singers of the age performed before audiences that included the king himself and the most sophisticated members of French society. An invitation to join this company was the ultimate recognition of artistic achievement, something that most singers could only dream of receiving. For Julie, who was still technically an outlaw, the invitation represented not just professional triumph, but potential salvation from her legal difficulties. The Paris Opera of the late 17th century was more than just a theater. It was a cultural institution that reflected and shaped the artistic tastes of European civilization. The building itself was a masterpiece of architecture and engineering, designed to showcase both the performances on stage and the social hierarchies of the audiences who attended them. The opera house featured elaborate decorations, sophisticated lighting systems, and acoustic design that had been perfected over decades of experimentation. The company that performed at the Paris Opera maintained artistic standards that were unmatched anywhere in Europe. The singers, musicians, dancers, and technical staff represented the finest talents that France could assemble, working together to create productions that combined musical excellence with dramatic sophistication and visual spectacle. To be accepted into this company meant joining an artistic elite whose members enjoyed not just professional success, but genuine social distinction. The offer came through intermediaries who recognized that Julie's extraordinary talents and notorious reputation could be valuable assets for an institution that thrived on creating memorable and talked-about performances. The Paris Opera needed singers who could not only deliver technically excellent performances, but who could also generate the kind of excitement and discussion that kept the aristocratic audiences engaged and enthusiastic. The negotiations surrounding Julie's potential employment were complex and delicate, requiring careful attention to both artistic and political considerations. Opera management had to balance their desire to secure her undeniable talents against the potential risks of associating their prestigious institution with someone who had such a controversial reputation. They needed assurances that she would not create scandals that might damage the opera's standing with royal patrons and aristocratic supporters. Julie, for her part, understood that joining the Paris Opera represented her best opportunity to achieve artistic greatness while also securing the kind of powerful protection that could shield her from her legal difficulties. She was willing to accept certain constraints on her behavior in exchange for the opportunity to work with the finest musicians and performers of her age, and to reach audiences that appreciated the highest levels of artistic achievement. Julie's debut at the Paris Opera was planned with all the theatrical flair that the institution was famous for. She was cast in the title role of Médée, one of the most demanding and dramatically complex roles in the French operatic repertoire. The character of Médée, the legendary sorceress who destroyed her own children to revenge herself on her unfaithful husband, required a performer who could convincingly portray both supernatural power and devastating human emotion. The choice of this particular role for Julie's debut was brilliantly calculated. Médée was a character who existed outside conventional social boundaries, whose actions were shocking and transgressive, and whose story resonated with themes of passion, revenge, and the consequences of defying social expectations. In many ways, the role seemed to have been written specifically for someone with Julie's background and temperament. The opera itself, composed by Marc-Antoine Charpentier, was a masterpiece of French Baroque music that required exceptional vocal and dramatic abilities from its lead performer. The title role demanded a singer who could master complex coloratura passages while also conveying the psychological complexity of a character who progressed from loving wife to vengeful sorceress over the course of the evening. The orchestral writing was equally sophisticated, featuring elaborate instrumental solos and intricate ensemble pieces that showcased the technical abilities of the opera's musicians. Preparing for her Paris debut required Julie to work at a level of intensity and sophistication that exceeded anything she had previously experienced. The Paris Opera maintained standards of artistic excellence that were unmatched anywhere in Europe, and performers were expected to bring not just technical skill, but genuine artistic vision to their roles. Julie threw herself into preparation with characteristic determination, working with the finest vocal coaches and dramatic instructors available. Her voice, already remarkable for its power and range, was refined and polished until it became an instrument of extraordinary subtlety and expressiveness. She learned to use every aspect of her vocal technique in service of dramatic truth, creating performances that were not just displays of beautiful singing, but genuine artistic statements that moved and transformed audiences. The coaching she received during this period expanded her understanding of operatic performance in ways that influenced her approach to all her subsequent roles. She worked with experts in French diction who helped her perfect the pronunciation and phrasing that would allow her voice to carry clearly throughout the large theater. She studied with movement coaches who taught her how to use her natural physical grace and strength in ways that enhanced rather than distracted from her vocal performance. But it was not just her voice that made Julie's performances at the Paris Opera revolutionary. Her background in sword fighting and her natural physical confidence gave her a stage presence that was unlike anything audiences had previously experienced from female performers. When she appeared as Médée, Part 4, The Birth of an Opera Star. As Julie's life on the road continued, her natural talents began to attract the attention of more sophisticated audiences and performers. The crude tavern performances that had sustained her during the early days of her independence were giving way to opportunities that would challenge and develop her abilities in ways she had never imagined. It was during this period of wandering and performing that Julie first encountered the world of opera, an art form that would become the foundation of her greatest achievements and lasting fame. The France of Louis XIV was experiencing a golden age of musical development, with opera emerging as the supreme form of aristocratic entertainment. The genre combined music, drama, and spectacle in ways that perfectly suited the tastes of a court that valued both artistic sophistication and theatrical grandeur. However, the world of opera was highly exclusive, dominated by a small number of established singers who jealously guarded their positions and were suspicious of newcomers, especially those who arrived without proper introductions or court connections. Opera in 17th century France was more than mere entertainment. It was a complex cultural institution that reflected and reinforced the social hierarchies of the ancien regime. The stories told in opera often dealt with themes of noble sacrifice, passionate love, and heroic virtue that resonated with aristocratic audiences who saw themselves reflected in these elevated characters. The music itself was sophisticated and demanding, requiring years of training to master the elaborate vocal techniques that audiences expected from professional performers. The opera houses of France were architectural marvels designed to showcase both the performances on stage and the social status of the audiences who attended them. The Paris Opera, in particular, was a temple to artistic excellence, where the finest composers, librettists, and performers collaborated to create works that would define musical taste throughout Europe. To be accepted into this rarefied world was the ultimate achievement for any musician, representing not just professional success, but social recognition of the highest order. Julie's entry into this rarefied world came about through a combination of chance, talent, and the kind of bold determination that characterized all her major life decisions. During one of her performances at a provincial fair, she was overheard by a traveling musician who recognized that her voice possessed qualities that were rare and valuable. Unlike the trained singers who dominated the major opera houses, Julie's voice had a natural power and emotional directness that could not be taught or imitated. This musician, whose name history has not preserved, but whose influence on Julie's career was crucial, was himself connected to the complex network of performers, composers, and patrons who supported operatic culture in France. He had spent years moving between different musical centers, always searching for new talent that might revitalize what was sometimes becoming a rather stale artistic scene. In Julie, he recognized not just vocal ability, but the kind of authentic passion that could transform conventional operatic roles into genuine, dramatic experiences. The musician spent several days observing Julie's performances, noting not just the quality of her voice, but her natural stage presence and her ability to connect emotionally with audiences. He saw that she possessed the rare combination of technical skill and authentic emotion that marked the greatest performers, and he began to understand that with proper training and opportunities, she might become something truly extraordinary in the opera world. His approach to Julie was careful and respectful, recognizing that she was not a naive country girl who could be easily manipulated, but an intelligent and independent woman who would need to be convinced that opera offered her opportunities worthy of her talents. He spoke with her about the artistic possibilities that formal operatic training might open up, describing the kinds of roles and performances that could challenge her abilities and allow her to reach audiences far more sophisticated than those she currently entertained. The musician arranged for Julie to audition for a minor opera company that was performing in Marseille, one of France's major provincial cities and an important center for maritime trade and cultural exchange. The company was far from the prestigious Paris Opera, but it maintained professional standards and had connections to the larger operatic world that could provide stepping stones for talented performers. The audition was unlike anything Julie had experienced before, requiring her to demonstrate not just her vocal abilities, but her capacity to inhabit the dramatic roles that opera demanded of its performers. She had to learn quickly not just specific musical pieces, but the entire culture and conventions of operatic performance, understanding how to use her voice, her body, and her emotional intelligence to create the kind of total artistic experience that opera audiences expected. Julie's first encounter with formal operatic training revealed both her tremendous natural gifts and the gaps in her musical education. Her voice was extraordinary, a rich contralto with remarkable range and power, but she lacked the technical training that most opera singers received from childhood. She had to learn quickly not just the specific techniques of operatic singing, but the entire culture and conventions of the opera world. The voice teachers who worked with Julie during this period were amazed by the raw quality of her instrument and her ability to learn complex techniques with remarkable speed. Her voice had a natural resonance and flexibility that allowed her to master difficult passages that gave other singers years of trouble. More importantly, she possessed an intuitive understanding of how to use her voice to convey genuine emotion, rather than merely producing beautiful sounds. The opera company in Marseille was far from the prestigious Paris Opera, but it provided Julie with exactly the kind of training ground she needed to develop her talents. She worked with experienced singers and musicians who helped her understand the subtleties of operatic performance, learning to use her voice not just as an instrument for producing beautiful sounds, but as a tool for creating complex emotional and dramatic effects. The repertoire she studied during this period included works by Jean-Baptiste Lully, the composer who had essentially created French opera as a distinct art form, as well as pieces by newer composers who were expanding the possibilities of what opera could express. Each role required her to master not just the musical demands of the part, but the dramatic and psychological complexities of the characters she would portray. During this period, Julie threw herself into her studies with the same intensity she had once devoted to sword work. She learned to read music fluently, mastered the elaborate vocal ornamentations that audiences expected, and developed the stamina necessary to sustain demanding roles through entire evenings of performance. But perhaps most importantly, she began to understand how her unique background and personality could enhance rather than hinder her operatic career. The physical conditioning she had developed through years of sword work and horsemanship proved invaluable in opera performance, giving her the breath control and stage presence that many singers struggled to achieve. Her experience of real danger and adventure had taught her to remain calm and focused under pressure, abilities that served her well when performing before critical and sometimes hostile audiences. Unlike many opera singers of her era, who were trained from childhood to suppress their individual personalities in favor of conventional artistic expressions, Julie brought a fierce authenticity to her performances that audiences found riveting. Her experience of real passion, danger, and adventure gave her an emotional depth that transformed even the most artificial operatic scenarios into compelling human dramas. Her first major role was in a production of an opera by Jean-Baptiste Lully, the composer who had virtually created French opera as an art form. The role required her to portray a warrior queen, a character type that might have seemed challenging for most female singers, but which played perfectly to Julie's unique combination of martial bearing and artistic sensitivity. When she appeared on stage in armor, sword at her side, singing with a voice that could fill the theater with its power and beauty, audiences were witnessing something genuinely revolutionary. The preparation for this role required Julie to integrate all the different aspects of her training and experience in ways that created something entirely new in French opera. She had to master the complex vocal lines that Lully had written, while also creating a believable portrayal of a character whose strength and authority came not from conventional feminine virtues, but from martial prowess and royal command. Her research for the role involved studying historical accounts of actual warrior queens, understanding how such women might have moved, spoken, and commanded in real life. She drew on her own experience of sword work and combat to create physical gestures and stage movements that had an authenticity that purely theatrical training could never have provided. The success of this performance marked the beginning of Julie's rapid rise through the ranks of French opera singers. Word of her extraordinary performances spread quickly through the network of musicians, critics, and aristocratic patrons who followed the opera world closely. She was no longer just a talented performer trying to establish herself. She was becoming a genuine sensation whose appearances could guarantee sold-out houses and enthusiastic reviews. What set Julie apart from other opera singers was not just her voice, remarkable as it was, but her complete embodiment of the roles she played. She brought to her performances the same total commitment that she brought to everything else in her life, whether it was sword fighting, love affairs, or any other pursuit that captured her passionate nature. Audiences could sense that they were witnessing not just a performance, but a genuine expression of a remarkable human being. Her approach to operatic performance was revolutionary in ways that influenced the development of the art form itself. Rather than simply singing the notes that composers had written, she found ways to make each musical phrase serve the dramatic truth of the character she was portraying. Her performances became psychological studies as much as musical exhibitions, creating a new standard for what opera could achieve as a form of theatrical art. The technical aspects of her vocal performance were equally innovative. Her contralto voice had a richness and power that allowed her to compete with the elaborate orchestral accompaniments that were becoming increasingly common in French opera. Yet she never used her vocal strength merely for display, always subordinating technical brilliance to dramatic necessity. Her success in Marseille opened doors to opportunities in larger cities and more prestigious companies. Opera managers who had initially been skeptical of this unconventional performer began to compete for her services, offering increasingly attractive contracts and more challenging roles. Julie was entering a world where her talents could flourish and where her unconventional background was becoming an asset rather than a liability. The financial rewards of her growing success allowed Julie to live with greater comfort and security than she had known since leaving her father's household. She could afford decent lodgings, good food, and the kind of clothing and accessories that were expected of successful performers. More importantly, she could begin to make choices about her career based on artistic considerations rather than mere survival. But even as her professional star was rising, Julie remained the same passionate, impulsive, and independent woman she had always been. Her success in opera did not moderate her tendency toward dramatic love affairs, dangerous adventures, or conflicts with authority. If anything, her growing fame and financial independence made her even more inclined to follow her own desires, regardless of social conventions or potential consequences. The opera world itself was a complex social environment that reflected many of the tensions and contradictions of French society as a whole. While performers could achieve considerable fame and financial success, they remained somewhat outside respectable society, viewed with a mixture of admiration and suspicion by the aristocratic audiences they entertained. Julie's position in this world was particularly complex because of her gender and her unconventional background. Female opera singers occupied an ambiguous social position, celebrated for their artistic achievements, but often viewed as morally suspect because of their public visibility and their association with the supposedly corrupting influence of theatrical life. Her growing reputation as both an artist and a woman of unconventional morals created a kind of celebrity that was both exciting and dangerous. She attracted devoted fans who celebrated her artistic achievements and her defiance of social conventions. But she also attracted critics and enemies who saw her success as a threat to traditional moral and social order. The stage was being set for the most famous and scandalous episode of Julie's early career, an adventure that would make her name known throughout France and establish her as one of the most notorious women of her generation. Her success in opera had given her the confidence and resources to pursue her desires with unprecedented boldness, and she was about to use both in service of a love affair that would shock even the relatively permissive society of Louis XIV's France. Julie d'Aubigny, the legendary 17th century swordswoman, opera singer, and bisexual icon. Part 1. The captivating opening. Imagine living in the 17th century when women were expected to be silent, obedient, and confined to their homes. Now imagine a woman who defied every single one of these expectations with a sword in one hand and a song in her heart. This is the story of Julie d'Aubigny, known as Mademoiselle Maupin, a woman so extraordinary that her life reads like the most outrageous fiction you could imagine. Picture this: a woman who could outfence any man in France, whose voice could make audiences weep with its beauty, who loved both men and women with equal passion, and who once burned down a convent to rescue her female lover. If you think this sounds too incredible to be true, you're about to discover that reality can be far stranger and more thrilling than any fairy tale. Julie lived during the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, in an era when France was the cultural center of Europe, yet remained bound by strict social conventions and religious morality. Women of her time were expected to marry young, bear children, and remain virtually invisible in public life. The idea of a woman wielding a sword was scandalous. The notion of one performing on stage was nearly unthinkable, and her open bisexuality was nothing short of revolutionary. What makes Julie's story so compelling is not just what she did, but when and where she did it. This was an age when dueling was a gentleman's affair, when opera was emerging as high art, and when the slightest deviation from social norms could mean exile or death. Yet Julie not only survived but thrived, becoming one of the most celebrated opera singers of her time, while simultaneously earning a reputation as one of the finest swordsmen in France. Her life was a series of dramatic episodes that seem almost too theatrical to believe. She seduced both men and women of the highest nobility, fought duels to defend her honor, and scandalized the court with her unconventional behavior. She was both celebrated and condemned, worshipped and vilified, embraced and exiled. Through it all, she remained utterly, defiantly herself. As we embark on this journey through her remarkable life, we'll discover how a woman born into minor nobility became a legend whose story continues to inspire people centuries later. From her unconventional childhood to her mysterious death, Julie's life was a masterpiece of passion, courage, and artistic brilliance that challenges everything we think we know about the possibilities of human existence in the pre-modern world. So settle in for a tale of love and sword fights, of beautiful music and burning convents, of a woman who refused to be contained by the expectations of her time and created her own legend in the process. Part 2. Origins and Unconventional Childhood. Julie d'Aubigny was born around 1670 into a world that would try its best to constrain her, though it would ultimately fail spectacularly. Her father, Gaston d'Aubigny, served as secretary to the Comte d'Armagnac, a position that placed the family firmly within the lower ranks of French nobility. While not wealthy or particularly influential, this connection to the aristocratic world would prove crucial in shaping Julie's extraordinary destiny. The France into which Julie was born was a nation at the height of its cultural and political power under Louis XIV, the Sun King. The royal court at Versailles had become the center of European civilization, setting standards for art, fashion, and behavior that were copied throughout the continent. Yet beneath this glittering surface lay a society bound by rigid social hierarchies and moral codes that left little room for individual expression, particularly for women. The d'Aubigny household was unlike most families of their social standing, where other fathers might focus on preparing their daughters for advantageous marriages through lessons in embroidery, music, and deportment. Gaston d'Aubigny had different ideas for his precocious daughter, perhaps recognizing her fierce spirit early on, or maybe simply because he lacked a son to carry on certain traditions. He decided to provide Julie with an education that was radically unconventional for girls of her era. Gaston d'Aubigny was himself an unusual man for his time, possessing progressive ideas about human potential that were rare among his contemporaries. His position as secretary to the Comte d'Armagnac had exposed him to diverse intellectual currents and unconventional personalities, broadening his understanding of what people might achieve if freed from traditional constraints. He saw in his daughter not just a future bride for some nobleman, but a unique individual whose extraordinary capabilities deserved cultivation regardless of social conventions. From a young age, Julie was taught the arts that were typically reserved for young gentlemen. She learned to fence with real swords, not the decorative weapons that some noble ladies might occasionally handle for show. Her instruction was serious and comprehensive, encompassing not just the basic techniques of swordplay, but the deeper philosophy and code of honor that governed dueling culture in 17th century France. She mastered the rapier, the weapon of choice for gentlemen, learning to thrust and parry with a precision that would later astonish and intimidate her opponents. The sword masters who taught Julie were initially skeptical about training a female student, but her natural aptitude and fierce dedication quickly won their respect. She approached sword work with the same intensity that others might bring to religious devotion, understanding instinctively that mastering these skills might be crucial to her survival in a world that was often hostile to unconventional women. Her training went beyond mere technique to include the psychological aspects of combat, the ability to read an opponent's intentions and weaknesses, and the mental discipline necessary to remain calm and focused in life-threatening situations. Her education extended beyond martial arts to include horsemanship, another skill considered essential for young men of good family, but unusual for women. Julie learned to ride not just sedately, as was expected of ladies taking gentle exercise, but with the skill and daring of a cavalry officer. She could control her mount in combat situations, understanding that in the world of dueling and adventure she was being prepared for, the ability to fight on horseback might mean the difference between life and death. The horses she learned to ride were not the gentle mares typically assigned to women, but spirited stallions that required strength, skill, and courage to control. Her riding instructors, like her sword masters, were initially doubtful about training a female student in advanced equestrian skills, but Julie's natural ability and fearless attitude quickly proved that she could master anything they taught her. She learned to jump obstacles, charge at full gallop, and fight from horseback with weapons drawn, skills that would later serve her well in the dangerous adventures that defined her adult life. But perhaps most importantly, her father ensured that Julie received an education in the classical sense. She learned to read and write in multiple languages, including Latin, Italian, and Spanish, giving her access to the greatest literature and philosophical works of European civilization. She studied history and literature, developing the quick wit and sharp intelligence that would serve her well in the sophisticated world of the French court. This intellectual foundation would later enable her to move confidently among the educated elite, holding her own in conversations about art, politics, and philosophy. Her studies included mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, subjects that were rarely taught to women, but which Julie mastered with the same dedication she brought to all her pursuits. She read the works of Descartes, Pascal, and other leading thinkers of her age, developing a sophisticated understanding of philosophical and scientific questions that impressed even learned men who encountered her in later life. The d'Aubigny family's connection to the Comte d'Armagnac meant that Julie was exposed from childhood to the intrigues and freedoms of court life. The Comte's household was known for its relatively relaxed attitude toward matters of love and sexuality, quite different from the strict moral codes that governed most of French society. Here, Julie witnessed firsthand that the rules governing ordinary people's lives were often more flexible for those with rank and influence. The Comte d'Armagnac himself was a fascinating character who had survived decades of court intrigue through a combination of intelligence, charm, and careful political maneuvering. His household attracted artists, philosophers, and free-thinking individuals who found in his protection the freedom to express ideas and pursue lifestyles that might have been dangerous elsewhere. This environment provided Julie with early exposure to the kind of intellectual and social sophistication that would later characterize her own circle of friends and associates. This early exposure to a more permissive environment was crucial in shaping Julie's later attitudes toward love and relationships. She learned that passion and desire were natural human experiences, not shameful secrets to be hidden. She saw that intelligent, powerful people often live by their own rules, rather than blindly following social conventions. These lessons would prove invaluable as she navigated her own complex romantic life in the years to come. The conversations she overheard in the Comte's household introduced her to ideas about individual freedom, artistic expression, and the rights of women that were radical for their time. She learned that some of the most brilliant and accomplished people in France questioned the social arrangements that most people accepted without thought. This early exposure to intellectual rebellion would later inform her own challenges to conventional behavior and expectations. As Julie entered adolescence, her unconventional education began to set her apart from other young women of her class. While her peers were learning to manage households and please future husbands, Julie was perfecting her sword work and developing her already remarkable singing voice. Her father had recognized that his daughter possessed not just fierce courage, but extraordinary artistic gifts, and he encouraged both aspects of her nature to flourish. Her musical education was as comprehensive as her training in martial arts and classical learning. She studied with some of the finest voice teachers in France, learning not just to sing beautifully, but to understand the complex relationship between music and emotion that would later make her such a compelling operatic performer. Her voice was naturally powerful and expressive, a rich contralto with remarkable range and flexibility that could convey the subtlest emotional nuances as well as the most dramatic climaxes. The combination of martial skill, artistic talent, and intellectual sophistication created a young woman who was utterly unique in her society. Julie possessed a confidence and self-possession that was rarely seen in women of any age, let alone teenagers. She moved through the world with the assurance of someone who knew her own worth and refused to be diminished by others' expectations or prejudices. Her physical presence was as striking as her intellectual and artistic abilities. She was tall for a woman of her era, with the kind of natural grace and athletic bearing that came from years of training in sword work and horsemanship. Her beauty was enhanced rather than diminished by her strength and confidence, creating an overall impression that was both feminine and formidable. Yet this unconventional upbringing came with costs as well as benefits. Julie's forthright manner and refusal to observe the subtle restrictions placed on women's behavior often put her at odds with more conventional members of society. She had little patience for the elaborate social dances that governed interactions between men and women in polite society, preferring direct communication to subtle hints and implications. Her education had prepared her for a life of action and achievement, but it had not taught her the arts of dissimulation and compromise that most women needed to navigate successfully in their restricted social roles. She was accustomed to expressing her opinions directly, pursuing her interests openly, and expecting to be judged on her abilities rather than her conformity to feminine ideals. The contrast between Julie's capabilities and the expectations placed on women of her class created internal tensions that would influence her entire life. She had been raised to believe in her own potential and worth, but she lived in a society that offered women few opportunities to realize that potential through conventional channels. This contradiction would drive her to create her own opportunities and define her own rules for living, regardless of the consequences. As she reached young adulthood, it became clear that Julie d'Aubigny would never fit into the traditional mold expected of women in her position. She was too talented, too intelligent, too passionate, and far too independent to accept a life of quiet domestic submission. The question was not whether she would rebel against society's expectations, but how dramatically and with what consequences she would do so. Her father, who had created this remarkable young woman through his unconventional approach to her education, began to realize that he might have prepared his daughter for a life that their society was not ready to accept. The very qualities he had cultivated in her, independence, courage, artistic brilliance, and intellectual sophistication, were precisely those that would make it difficult for her to find happiness within conventional social arrangements. The stage was set for a life that would challenge every assumption about what was possible for women in the 17th century, and Julie was more than ready to play her part with all the skill, courage, and artistry she possessed. She had been given the tools to reshape the world around her, and she would spend the rest of her life using those tools to carve out a unique place for herself in history. Part 3. First Love and the Great Escape. The transition from Julie's unconventional childhood to her scandalous young adulthood began with what might have seemed like a typical teenage romance, but which would prove to be anything but ordinary. At the age of 14, Julie found herself powerfully attracted to one of her father's assistants, a young man whose name history has not preserved, but whose influence on her life was profound and lasting. This early relationship was Julie's first real taste of the kind of passionate love that would define her entire existence. Unlike the arranged marriages that were the norm for women of her class, this was a connection based on genuine desire and mutual attraction. The young man was impressed not just by Julie's beauty, which was considerable, but by her remarkable intelligence and the unique skills her father had taught her. Here was a woman who could discuss literature and philosophy as easily as she could demonstrate sword techniques, and the combination was intoxicating. The assistant, whose position in the d'Aubigny household was relatively modest, but who possessed considerable education and refinement, found himself dealing with feelings he had never experienced before. Julie was unlike any woman he had ever encountered, combining physical beauty with intellectual sophistication and a kind of fierce independence that was both attractive and intimidating. Their conversations ranged from discussions of classical literature to debates about contemporary politics, from technical analyses of sword work to passionate exchanges about the nature of love and human desire. For Julie, this relationship represented her first experience of being valued for her complete self, rather than just the conventional feminine qualities that society deemed important. Her lover appreciated her sword work as much as her beauty, admired her quick wit as much as her grace. This acceptance of her full nature, including the aspects that others might find troubling or inappropriate, set a pattern that would influence all of her future relationships. Their romance developed with the intensity that was characteristic of all Julie's emotional involvements. They met secretly in various locations around the d'Aubigny estate, sharing not just physical passion, but intellectual and emotional intimacy of a kind that was rare in their society. They read poetry together, practiced sword work, and engaged in the kind of philosophical discussions that challenged both their minds and their assumptions about life and society. The young man introduced Julie to ideas and perspectives that broadened her understanding of the world beyond her father's household. He had traveled more widely than she had, encountering different cultures and ways of thinking that opened up new possibilities for how life might be lived. Through him, she began to understand that the constraints of French society were not universal truths, but particular arrangements that could potentially be challenged or changed. Their physical relationship was as intense as their intellectual connection, marked by the kind of passion that both participants found overwhelming and transformative. For Julie, who had been raised with relatively progressive ideas about sexuality, this was a natural expression of deep feeling. For her lover, who came from a more conventional background, the intensity of their connection was both thrilling and somewhat frightening. However, their affair could not remain secret for long in the relatively small world of the d'Aubigny household. When Gaston d'Aubigny discovered his daughter's involvement with his assistant, he was faced with a situation that threatened not just his family's reputation, but his own position with the Comte d'Armagnac. The relationship had to end immediately, and the young man was dismissed from his position with stern warnings about the consequences of any further contact with Julie. Gaston's reaction to the discovery was complex, mixing parental concern with practical calculations about the potential consequences of the scandal. He recognized that his daughter's behavior, while perhaps understandable given her unconventional upbringing, could destroy the family's social position and his own career prospects. Yet he also understood that Julie's passionate nature was partly the result of the very qualities he had encouraged in her education. The confrontation between father and daughter was dramatic and painful for both participants. Julie felt betrayed by what she saw as her father's abandonment of the principles of individual freedom and authentic emotion that he had taught her to value. Gaston felt torn between his love for his daughter and his recognition that her behavior could have devastating consequences for the entire family. But Gaston d'Aubigny had perhaps taught his daughter too well the lessons of independence and self-determination. Julie had no intention of meekly accepting the termination of a relationship that had brought her such happiness and fulfillment. If society and family would not permit her to love whom she chose, then she would simply have to step outside the bounds of society and family to continue doing so. The decision to elope was not made lightly, but once Julie had made up her mind, she pursued her course with the same determination and skill that characterized everything she did. She and her lover carefully planned their escape, understanding that once they left the protection of her father's household, they would be on their own in a world that was often hostile to those who violated its conventions. Their planning required considerable ingenuity and careful attention to detail. They had to accumulate resources for their journey without arousing suspicion, identify safe routes and destinations, and prepare for the various challenges they would face as fugitives from conventional society. Julie's education in classical literature provided them with models of famous lovers who had defied society, while her practical training in combat and survival skills would prove essential for their safety. The lovers spent weeks carefully observing the routines of the household, identifying the best times and routes for their escape. They gathered supplies in small quantities over time, hiding them in various locations around the estate. Julie selected the weapons and other equipment she would need, while her companion used his knowledge of French geography to plan their route and identify potential sources of support along the way. Their elopement was executed with all the drama and daring that would characterize Julie's entire life. Under cover of darkness, she slipped away from her family home, carrying only the most essential possessions and the sword that her father had taught her to use. The young couple disappeared into the night, beginning a new phase of their lives that would be marked by adventure, uncertainty, and constant danger. The escape itself was a masterpiece of timing and execution. They had identified a window of opportunity when the household guards would be changing shifts, creating a brief period when their departure was least likely to be detected. Julie moved through the estate with the silence and precision that her years of training had taught her, while her companion waited with horses at a predetermined meeting point outside the estate boundaries. Once they were clear of immediate pursuit, the young couple faced the reality of life as fugitives from conventional society. They had burned their bridges behind them, making it impossible to return to their former lives, even if they had wanted to. Their future would depend entirely on their own resources, skills, and determination to create new identities and opportunities for themselves. Life on the road proved to be both more difficult and more exhilarating than either Julie or her lover had anticipated. Without the protection of family connections or established social position, they had to find ways to support themselves that drew on their particular talents and skills. It was during this period that Julie first began to explore the possibilities of making a living through the abilities her unconventional education had given her. The France of the late 17th century was a place where skilled entertainers could find work, albeit often in circumstances that were far from respectable by conventional standards. Julie and her companion began performing at fairs, markets, and taverns, offering demonstrations of swordplay that amazed and delighted audiences who had never seen anything like the combination of skill and showmanship that Julie brought to her performances. These early performances were crude compared to the sophisticated entertainments Julie would later be part of, but they served their purpose of keeping the young couple fed and housed while they figured out their next moves. More importantly, they gave Julie her first taste of the intoxicating experience of performing for an audience, of using her remarkable abilities to create moments of wonder and excitement for other people. The audiences at these rural entertainments had probably never seen a woman handle a sword with such skill and confidence. Julie's performances combined technical excellence with natural theatrical flair, creating spectacles that were both impressive and entertaining. She learned to play to a crowd, to build suspense and excitement, to create the kind of memorable moments that would keep people talking long after the performance was over. Her sword work during these performances was not just demonstration, but genuine artistry, transforming mere technical skill into dramatic entertainment that engaged audiences emotionally as well as intellectually. She developed a repertoire of spectacular moves and combinations that showcased her abilities while creating the kind of visual excitement that rural audiences craved. But it was not just her sword work that began to attract attention during this period. Julie's extraordinary singing voice, which had been trained in the more formal setting of her father's household, found new expression in the less constrained environment of popular entertainment. She began to incorporate songs into her performances, discovering that her voice had a power to move audiences that was every bit as impressive as her skill with a blade. The combination of martial prowess and musical talent made Julie a unique performer, even in the diverse world of traveling entertainers. She was beginning to understand that her unconventional education had given her not just skills, but a kind of artistic vision that could transform even the simplest performance into something memorable and moving. As weeks turned into months, Julie and her lover established a rhythm of life that was unlike anything either had experienced before. They were free from the constraints of conventional society, but this freedom came at the cost of security and respectability. They lived from performance to performance, never sure where their next meal would come from or where they would sleep each night. Yet for Julie, this period of uncertainty and adventure was also a time of tremendous growth and self-discovery. She was learning to trust her own abilities, to rely on her skills and intelligence rather than on family connections or social position. She was discovering that she could not only survive outside the conventional structures of her society, but could actually thrive, creating her own opportunities and defining her own success. The challenges of life on the road taught Julie lessons about human nature, social dynamics, and survival that no formal education could have provided. She learned to read audiences, to assess potential threats, and to navigate the complex social hierarchies that existed even among traveling performers and rural audiences. These skills would prove invaluable in her later career as she moved among the sophisticated but equally treacherous social circles of the Parisian cultural elite. Part 4. The Birth of an Opera Star. As Julie's life on the road continued, her natural talents began to attract the attention of more sophisticated audiences and performers. The crude tavern performances that had sustained her during the early days of her independence were giving way to opportunities that would challenge and develop her abilities in ways she had never imagined. It was during this period of wandering and performing that Julie first encountered the world of opera, an art form that would become the foundation of her greatest achievements and lasting fame. The France of Louis XIV was experiencing a golden age of musical development, with opera emerging as the supreme form of aristocratic entertainment. The genre combined music, drama, and spectacle in ways that perfectly suited the tastes of a court that valued both artistic sophistication and theatrical grandeur. However, the world of opera was highly exclusive, dominated by a small number of established singers who jealously guarded their positions and were suspicious of newcomers, especially those who arrived without proper introductions or court connections. Julie's entry into this rarefied world came about through a combination of chance, talent, and the kind of bold determination that characterized all her major life decisions. During one of her performances at a provincial fair, she was overheard by a traveling musician who recognized that her voice possessed qualities that were rare and valuable. Unlike the trained singers who dominated the major opera houses, Julie's voice had a natural power and emotional directness that could not be taught or imitated. This musician, whose name history has not preserved, but whose influence on Julie's career was crucial, arranged for her to audition for a minor opera company that was performing in Marseille. The audition was unlike anything Julie had experienced before, requiring her to demonstrate not just her vocal abilities, but her capacity to inhabit the dramatic roles that opera demanded of its performers. Julie's first encounter with formal operatic training revealed both her tremendous natural gifts and the gaps in her musical education. Her voice was extraordinary, a rich contralto with remarkable range and power, but she lacked the technical training that most opera singers received from childhood. She had to learn quickly not just the specific techniques of operatic singing, but the entire culture and conventions of the opera world. The opera company in Marseille was far from the prestigious Paris Opera, but it provided Julie with exactly the kind of training ground she needed to develop her talents. She worked with experienced singers and musicians who helped her understand the subtleties of operatic performance, learning to use her voice not just as an instrument for producing beautiful sounds, but as a tool for creating complex emotional and dramatic effects. During this period, Julie threw herself into her studies with the same intensity she had once devoted to sword work. She learned to read music fluently, mastered the elaborate vocal ornamentations that audiences expected, and developed the stamina necessary to sustain demanding roles through entire evenings of performance. But perhaps most importantly, she began to understand how her unique background and personality could enhance rather than hinder her operatic career. Unlike many opera singers of her era, who were trained from childhood to suppress their individual personalities in favor of conventional artistic expressions, Julie brought a fierce authenticity to her performances that audiences found riveting. Her experience of real passion, danger, and adventure gave her an emotional depth that transformed even the most artificial operatic scenarios into compelling human dramas. Her first major role was in a production of an opera by Jean-Baptiste Lully, the composer who had virtually created French opera as an art form. The role required her to portray a warrior queen, a character type that might have seemed challenging for most female singers, but which played perfectly to Julie's unique combination of martial bearing and artistic sensitivity. When she appeared on stage in armor, sword at her side, singing with a voice that could fill the theater with its power and beauty, audiences were witnessing something genuinely revolutionary. The success of this performance marked the beginning of Julie's rapid rise through the ranks of French opera singers. Word of her extraordinary performances spread quickly through the network of musicians, critics, and aristocratic patrons who followed the opera world closely. She was no longer just a talented performer trying to establish herself. She was becoming a genuine sensation whose appearances could guarantee sold-out houses and enthusiastic reviews. What set Julie apart from other opera singers was not just her voice, remarkable as it was, but her complete embodiment of the roles she played. She brought to her performances the same total commitment that she brought to everything else in her life, whether it was sword fighting, love affairs, or any other pursuit that captured her passionate nature. Audiences could sense that they were witnessing not just a performance, but a genuine expression of a remarkable human being. Her success in Marseille opened doors to opportunities in larger cities and more prestigious companies. Opera managers who had initially been skeptical of this unconventional performer began to compete for her services, offering increasingly attractive contracts and more challenging roles. Julie was entering a world where her talents could flourish and where her unconventional background was becoming an asset rather than a liability. But even as her professional star was rising, Julie remained the same passionate, impulsive, and independent woman she had always been. Her success in opera did not moderate her tendency toward dramatic love affairs, dangerous adventures, or conflicts with authority. If anything, her growing fame and financial independence made her even more inclined to follow her own desires, regardless of social conventions or potential consequences. The stage was being set for the most famous and scandalous episode of Julie's early career, an adventure that would make her name known throughout France and establish her as one of the most notorious women of her generation. Her success in opera had given her the confidence and resources to pursue her desires with unprecedented boldness, and she was about to use both in service of a love affair that would shock even the relatively permissive society of Louis XIV's France. Part 5. The Convent Burning Scandal. Among all the extraordinary episodes in Julie d'Aubigny's remarkable life, none captures the imagination quite like her legendary rescue of a young woman from a convent, an adventure that combined elements of romance, deception, arson, and dramatic escape in ways that seem almost too theatrical to be believed. Yet this incident, which occurred when Julie was at the height of her early success as an opera singer, demonstrates both her capacity for passionate love and her willingness to take extraordinary risks to protect those she cared about. The story begins with Julie's encounter with a young woman whose beauty and intelligence immediately captivated her. Unlike Julie's previous relationships, which had often been with fellow artists or members of the theatrical world who understood and accepted unconventional behavior, this new love was the daughter of a wealthy and conservative family that had very specific expectations about their daughter's future. The young woman, whose name has been lost to history, but whose influence on Julie's life was profound, represented everything that Julie found most attractive: intelligence, beauty, courage, and a spirit of independence that matched her own. The aristocratic family into which this young woman had been born represented the pinnacle of French social conservatism, maintaining strict control over their children's behavior and marriage prospects as a way of preserving their wealth, status, and influence. Their daughter was expected to marry advantageously, produce heirs for the family line, and live according to the rigid moral codes that governed aristocratic women's lives. Yet beneath the surface of conventional behavior that her family demanded, the young woman possessed a passionate nature and intellectual curiosity that made her deeply unhappy with the restricted life that awaited her. She was well educated, as befitted her social position, but her education was designed to make her an ornament to her future husband, rather than to develop her individual talents and interests. When she encountered Julie, either at a performance or through the complex social networks that connected different levels of French society, she found herself face to face with a woman who embodied everything she had been taught to suppress in herself. Julie represented the possibility of a life lived according to personal choice rather than family obligation, of passion expressed rather than concealed, of individual talent celebrated rather than hidden. Their relationship developed quickly and intensely, as was typical of Julie's romantic involvements. They met secretly, often in locations connected to Julie's performances, sharing not just physical passion, but intellectual and emotional intimacy of a kind that was rare between women in their society. For the young woman, who had been raised in a world of strict social conventions and limited opportunities, Julie represented a revelation of possibilities she had never imagined for herself. The secrecy required by their relationship added both excitement and strain to their connection. They had to develop elaborate codes and signals to communicate, arrange meetings in locations where they would not be observed by servants or family members who might report their activities. The constant need for deception and the ever-present danger of discovery created an atmosphere of romantic tension that intensified their feelings for each other. Julie introduced her lover to ideas and experiences that challenged everything she had been taught about women's roles and possibilities. They read banned books together, discussed philosophical questions about individual freedom and social obligation, and explored forms of physical and emotional intimacy that the young woman had never imagined possible. Through Julie, she began to understand that the limitations placed on her life were not natural laws, but social conventions that could potentially be challenged. For several months, they managed to maintain their secret relationship while both continued to fulfill their public obligations. Julie performed regularly and continued to build her reputation in the opera world, while her lover participated in the social activities expected of a young woman of her rank. Yet both found their double lives increasingly difficult to sustain as their feelings for each other deepened, and the contrast between their private happiness and public conformity became more painful. The crisis came when the young woman's family began making serious arrangements for her marriage to a man she found completely repugnant. The proposed husband was wealthy and well-connected, making him an ideal match from her family's perspective, but he was also significantly older, reportedly cruel to his servants and previous wives, and completely uninterested in his future bride's thoughts or feelings about the arrangement. The prospect of this marriage forced the young woman to confront the reality that her current life of secret meetings and hidden passion could not continue indefinitely. She would soon be bound by legal and religious ties to a man she despised, living in his household under his complete control, expected to bear his children and submit to his authority in all matters. The freedom she had discovered through her relationship with Julie would be permanently lost. However, their affair could not remain secret indefinitely. The young woman's family, discovering evidence of their daughter's relationship with the notorious opera singer, reacted with horror and determination to end the scandalous involvement immediately. In their view, their daughter had been corrupted by exposure to the immoral world of the theater, and drastic action was necessary to save both her soul and the family's reputation. Her audition for admission to the convent was a masterpiece of theatrical deception. Julie presented herself as a young woman who had experienced a religious conversion and now sought to dedicate her life to serving God in the peace and security of religious community. She spoke of renouncing the temptations of worldly life and embracing the disciplines of prayer, work, and contemplation that define monastic existence. The nuns who interviewed her were impressed by her apparent sincerity and devotion, never suspecting that they were being deceived by one of France's most accomplished performers. Julie's years of experience in creating believable characters on the opera stage served her well in this real-life drama where the stakes were far higher than any theatrical performance. Once inside the convent, Julie faced the challenge of locating her lover without arousing suspicion while maintaining her disguise as a devout novice. She participated in the daily routines of prayer and work that structured life in the religious community, all while searching for opportunities to explore the building and make contact with the woman she had come to rescue. The reunion, when it finally occurred, was both joyful and terrifying. Julie's lover was amazed and delighted to see her, but also deeply concerned about the risks Julie was taking. The convent was not a prison in the literal sense, but escape would be extremely difficult, and discovery would result in serious legal consequences for both women. Julie's plan for their escape was as dramatic as her infiltration had been subtle. Rather than attempting to slip away quietly, which would have been nearly impossible given the convent's security measures, she decided to create a diversion that would occupy everyone's attention while she and her lover made their getaway. Late one night, Julie set fire to one of the convent's outbuildings, calculating that the flames would create enough confusion and panic to allow their escape in the chaos that followed. The fire spread more quickly than she had anticipated, threatening not just the building she had targeted, but potentially the entire complex. In the darkness and confusion, with nuns running to fight the flames and secure valuable religious artifacts, Julie and her lover were able to slip away into the night. Their escape was successful, but the consequences were severe and long-lasting. The authorities quickly determined that the fire had been deliberately set. An investigation revealed the connection to the mysterious novice who had disappeared the same night. Julie's identity was discovered, and she found herself facing charges of arson, kidnapping, and various other serious crimes. The legal situation was complicated by Julie's growing fame and the protection afforded by her connections to influential patrons of the arts. However, the severity of the charges and the scandal they created meant that she could not simply return to her normal life and career as if nothing had happened. She was sentenced to death in absentia, a judgment that could only be enforced if she were captured, but which effectively made her an outlaw who had to be constantly careful about where she went and whom she associated with. Part 6. Triumph at the Paris Opera. Following the dramatic events at the convent, Julie d'Aubigny found herself in the paradoxical position of being both a wanted criminal and an increasingly celebrated artist. The scandal had made her name known throughout France, but rather than destroying her career, the notoriety seemed to enhance her appeal to audiences who were fascinated by her combination of artistic brilliance and dangerous reputation. It was during this period of exile and uncertainty that she received an invitation that would transform her from a provincial opera singer into one of the most celebrated performers of her generation. The Académie Royale de Musique, known simply as the Paris Opera, was the pinnacle of French musical culture, the institution where the greatest singers of the age performed before audiences that included the king himself and the most sophisticated members of French society. An invitation to join this company was the ultimate recognition of artistic achievement, something that most singers could only dream of receiving. For Julie, who was still technically an outlaw, the invitation represented not just professional triumph, but potential salvation from her legal difficulties. The offer came through intermediaries who recognized that Julie's extraordinary talents and notorious reputation could be valuable assets for an institution that thrived on creating memorable and talked-about performances. The Paris Opera needed singers who could not only deliver technically excellent performances, but who could also generate the kind of excitement and discussion that kept the aristocratic audiences engaged and enthusiastic. Julie's debut at the Paris Opera was planned with all the theatrical flair that the institution was famous for. She was cast in the title role of Médée, one of the most demanding and dramatically complex roles in the French operatic repertoire. The character of Médée, the legendary sorceress who destroyed her own children to revenge herself on her unfaithful husband, required a performer who could convincingly portray both supernatural power and devastating human emotion. The choice of this particular role for Julie's debut was brilliantly calculated. Médée was a character who existed outside conventional social boundaries, whose actions were shocking and transgressive, and whose story resonated with themes of passion, revenge, and the consequences of defying social expectations. In many ways, the role seemed to have been written specifically for someone with Julie's background and temperament. Preparing for her Paris debut required Julie to work at a level of intensity and sophistication that exceeded anything she had previously experienced. The Paris Opera maintained standards of artistic excellence that were unmatched anywhere in Europe, and performers were expected to bring not just technical skill, but genuine artistic vision to their roles. Julie threw herself into preparation with characteristic determination, working with the finest vocal coaches and dramatic instructors available. Her voice, already remarkable for its power and range, was refined and polished until it became an instrument of extraordinary subtlety and expressiveness. She learned to use every aspect of her vocal technique in service of dramatic truth, creating performances that were not just displays of beautiful singing, but genuine artistic statements that moved and transformed audiences. But it was not just her voice that made Julie's performances at the Paris Opera revolutionary. Her background in sword fighting and her natural physical confidence gave her a stage presence that was unlike anything audiences had previously experienced from female performers. When she appeared as Médée, she brought a sense of genuine danger and power to the role that made the character's supernatural abilities seem completely believable. Her first performance was a sensation that exceeded even the high expectations that had surrounded her debut. From the moment she appeared on stage, it was clear that audiences were witnessing something unprecedented in French opera. Julie's combination of vocal brilliance, dramatic intensity, and physical charisma created performances that were both artistically sophisticated and emotionally overwhelming. The opening night audience included many of the most influential cultural figures in France, as well as members of the royal court who had come to evaluate this notorious new addition to their favorite entertainment. The atmosphere in the theater was electric with anticipation and curiosity about how this scandalous woman would perform in the most prestigious venue in French cultural life. Julie's entrance as Médée was dramatically staged to take advantage of her unique presence and abilities. She appeared in an elaborate costume that emphasized both her femininity and her power, moving with a combination of grace and authority that immediately commanded the audience's attention. When she began to sing, her voice filled the theater with a richness and power that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The critics, who had been skeptical about whether a performer with Julie's scandalous reputation could meet the artistic standards of the Paris Opera, were forced to acknowledge that they were witnessing genuine greatness. Her Médée was praised not just for its technical excellence, but for its psychological depth and emotional authenticity. She had managed to take a mythological character and make her completely human while never diminishing her supernatural power. The dramatic climax of the opera, in which Médée murders her own children to punish her unfaithful husband, required Julie to portray emotions of such intensity and complexity that few singers had ever successfully managed the scene. Julie's performance of this crucial moment was so powerful and convincing that audience members were moved to tears, completely caught up in the tragic fate of a character they had initially seen as a villain. Word of Julie's performances spread quickly through Parisian society, and soon attendance at her appearances became a mark of cultural sophistication. The king himself attended several of her performances, and his approval effectively ended any official persecution related to her earlier legal troubles. It seemed that artistic genius could indeed triumph over social scandal, at least for someone with Julie's extraordinary talents. Louis XIV's attendance at Julie's performances was particularly significant because of his well-known interest in the arts and his role as the ultimate arbiter of cultural taste in France. The Sun King's court at Versailles had become the center of European artistic life, and his approval of a performer could make or break careers. His presence at Julie's performances and his obvious enjoyment of her artistry sent a clear message that she had achieved the highest level of official recognition. Her success in Médée led to opportunities to perform other major roles in the Paris Opera repertoire. She excelled as Dido in Purcell's opera, bringing the same combination of vocal mastery and dramatic truth that had made her Médée so memorable. Each new role seemed to reveal different aspects of her artistic abilities, demonstrating that her talent was not limited to a particular type of character or musical style. Her portrayal of Dido, the tragic queen of Carthage who falls in love with Aeneas only to be abandoned by him, allowed Julie to explore different emotional territories while showcasing the full range of her vocal abilities. The role required both the regal bearing of a queen and the vulnerable humanity of a woman destroyed by love, a combination that perfectly suited Julie's unique blend of strength and sensitivity. The music for Dido was particularly challenging, featuring elaborate arias that required both technical precision and deep emotional understanding. Julie's performance of Dido's final aria, in which the abandoned queen prepares for suicide, became one of the most celebrated moments in French opera, with audiences often demanding encores despite the tragic nature of the scene. Julie's performances were notable not just for their individual excellence, but for the way they seemed to elevate the entire art form. She brought an intensity and authenticity to operatic performance that influenced other singers and helped establish new standards for what audiences could expect from great opera. Her approach to combining music and drama became a model that other performers studied and attempted to emulate. The financial rewards of her success at the Paris Opera were substantial, allowing Julie to live with a luxury and independence that few women of her era could imagine. She established herself in elegant apartments near the theater, surrounding herself with beautiful objects and interesting people, and enjoyed the kind of lifestyle that her artistic achievements had earned. Her home became a salon where artists, intellectuals, and aristocrats gathered to discuss art, politics, and philosophy. The social circle that formed around Julie during this period included some of the most fascinating and accomplished people in France. Writers, composers, philosophers, and political figures were drawn to her combination of artistic genius and unconventional personality. Her conversations were as celebrated as her performances, with visitors often reporting that an evening at her home was as memorable as any theatrical entertainment. But material success, satisfying as it was, represented only one aspect of what her triumph at the Paris Opera meant to her. More importantly, her success had given her a platform from which she could live according to her own values and desires without having to constantly worry about social disapproval or legal consequences. She had achieved a position in the society where her unconventional behavior was accepted, even celebrated, as part of her artistic persona. The very qualities that had once made her an outlaw were now seen as evidence of the passionate temperament that made her such a compelling performer. Her reputation for dramatic love affairs, dangerous adventures, and conflicts with authority became part of her mystique, adding to, rather than detracting from her appeal to audiences who lived much more constrained lives. Her relationship with her audiences was unique among opera singers of her era. They came not just to hear beautiful singing, but to witness the performances of someone whose life was as dramatic and compelling as any opera plot. Julie had become not just a performer, but a genuine celebrity, someone whose personal life was as fascinating to the public as her professional achievements. The Paris Opera itself benefited enormously from Julie's presence in the company. Her performances consistently sold out, attracting audiences that included not just regular opera enthusiasts, but people who came specifically to see the legendary woman whose adventures had made her famous throughout Europe. The opera house's reputation was enhanced by its association with such a celebrated and notorious performer. Her influence extended beyond her own performances to affect the entire artistic environment of the Paris Opera. Other singers were inspired to take greater risks in their own interpretations. Composers began writing roles that took advantage of the kind of dramatic intensity that Julie had introduced to French opera, and audiences developed more sophisticated expectations about what operatic performance could achieve. Yet even at the height of her success at the Paris Opera, Julie remained the same impulsive, passionate, and unpredictable woman she had always been. Success had not tamed her spirit or made her more conventional in her personal life. If anything, her secure position at the opera gave her even more freedom to pursue the kind of dramatic romantic adventures that had always defined her character. The stage was set for the next phase of her extraordinary life, one that would involve even more complex romantic entanglements and demonstrate once again that Julie d'Aubigny was incapable of living according to anyone's expectations but her own. Her triumph at the Paris Opera had given her the security and confidence to pursue her desires with even greater boldness, and she was about to embark on romantic adventures that would create new legends and scandals that would ensure her place in history as one of the most remarkable women of her age. Her first performance was a sensation that exceeded even the high expectations that had surrounded her debut. From the moment she appeared on stage, it was clear that audiences were witnessing something unprecedented in French opera. Julie's combination of vocal brilliance, dramatic intensity, and physical charisma created performances that were both artistically sophisticated and emotionally overwhelming. The critics, who had been skeptical about whether a performer with Julie's scandalous reputation could meet the artistic standards of the Paris Opera, were forced to acknowledge that they were witnessing genuine greatness. Her Médée was praised not just for its technical excellence, but for its psychological depth and emotional authenticity. She had managed to take a mythological character and make her completely human while never diminishing her supernatural power. Word of Julie's performances spread quickly through Parisian society, and soon attendance at her appearances became a mark of cultural sophistication. The king himself attended several of her performances, and his approval effectively ended any official persecution related to her earlier legal troubles. It seemed that artistic genius could indeed triumph over social scandal, at least for someone with Julie's extraordinary talents. Her success in Médée led to opportunities to perform other major roles in the Paris Opera repertoire. She excelled as Dido in Purcell's opera, bringing the same combination of vocal mastery and dramatic truth that had made her Médée so memorable. Each new role seemed to reveal different aspects of her artistic abilities, demonstrating that her talent was not limited to a particular type of character or musical style. Julie's performances were notable not just for their individual excellence, but for the way they seemed to elevate the entire art form. She brought an intensity and authenticity to operatic performance that influenced other singers and helped establish new standards for what audiences could expect from great opera. Her approach to combining music and drama became a model that other performers studied and attempted to emulate. The financial rewards of her success at the Paris Opera were substantial, allowing Julie to live with a luxury and independence that few women of her era could imagine. She established herself in elegant apartments, surrounded herself with beautiful objects and interesting people, and enjoyed the kind of lifestyle that her artistic achievements had earned. But material success, satisfying as it was, represented only one aspect of what her triumph at the Paris Opera meant to her. More importantly, her success had given her a platform from which she could live according to her own values and desires, without having to constantly worry about social disapproval or legal consequences. She had achieved a position in society where her unconventional behavior was accepted, even celebrated, as part of her artistic persona. The very qualities that had once made her an outlaw were now seen as evidence of the passionate temperament that made her such a compelling performer. Her relationship with her audiences was unique among opera singers of her era. They came not just to hear beautiful singing, but to witness the performances of someone whose life was as dramatic and compelling as any opera plot. Julie had become not just a performer, but a genuine celebrity, someone whose personal life was as fascinating to the public as her professional achievements. Yet even at the height of her success at the Paris Opera, Julie remained the same impulsive, passionate, and unpredictable woman she had always been. Success had not tamed her spirit or made her more conventional in her personal life. If anything, her secure position at the opera gave her even more freedom to pursue the kind of dramatic romantic adventures that had always defined her character. Part 7. Complex Affairs of the Heart. Julie d'Aubigny's success at the Paris Opera provided her with unprecedented freedom to pursue her romantic inclinations without the fear of social or financial consequences that had constrained her earlier relationships. Her position as one of France's most celebrated performers meant that her unconventional love life, rather than being seen as scandalous, was often viewed as simply another aspect of her artistic temperament. This newfound liberty allowed her to explore relationships of remarkable complexity and intensity, involving partners from across the spectrum of French society. One of her most significant relationships during this period was with Gabriel Vincent Thévenard, a fellow opera singer whose voice and dramatic abilities complemented her own in ways that created both professional and personal harmony. Thévenard was already established as one of the leading male singers at the Paris Opera when Julie arrived, and their partnership on stage quickly developed into a passionate affair that captivated both participants and observers. Thévenard possessed a bass baritone voice of exceptional power and flexibility, making him the ideal partner for Julie's rich contralto in the dramatic duets that were central to French opera of the period. He was also a man of considerable intelligence and sophistication, well-educated in literature and philosophy, and capable of engaging Julie in the kind of intellectual discourse that she found as stimulating as physical passion. Their relationship was unusual in the opera world for its equality and mutual respect. Unlike many relationships between male and female performers, where the woman was often expected to defer to her partner's greater experience or supposedly superior artistic judgment, Julie and Thévenard functioned as genuine equals who challenged and inspired each other to achieve greater artistic heights. Their professional collaboration was marked by a creative synergy that elevated both their individual performances and their work together. They developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's musical and dramatic instincts, allowing them to create spontaneous moments of artistic brilliance that could never have been achieved through rehearsal alone. Their duets became legendary for their emotional authenticity and technical perfection. Their performances together were legendary for their intensity and emotional authenticity. When they appeared on stage as lovers or adversaries, audiences could sense the real passion and understanding that existed between them. This authentic emotional connection translated into performances that transcended mere technical excellence and became genuine artistic revelations that audiences would remember for years afterward. The private aspect of their relationship was equally intense, marked by passionate discussions about art, literature, and the nature of human emotion that often lasted throughout the night. They read poetry together, analyzed the psychological motivations of the characters they portrayed, and engaged in the kind of intellectual intimacy that was rare between any two people, regardless of gender. Thevenard introduced Julie to aspects of musical theory and composition that expanded her understanding of opera as an art form. Through him, she learned to analyze the structural elements that made certain musical passages particularly effective, understanding how composers used harmony, rhythm, and melody to create specific emotional effects. This deeper knowledge enhanced her own performances by allowing her to make more informed choices about interpretation and phrasing. But Julie's capacity for love was never limited to a single relationship, regardless of how satisfying or artistically productive it might be. Even while maintaining her connection with Thevenard, she continued to pursue relationships with women who attracted her, often members of the aristocracy who were drawn to her combination of artistic brilliance and dangerous reputation. These relationships with aristocratic women were more than mere affairs. They were genuine connections based on intellectual compatibility and shared rebellion against the constraints of conventional society. Many of the women Julie became involved with were trapped in loveless marriages or restricted by family expectations that prevented them from pursuing their own desires and ambitions. In Julie, they found not just a lover, but a model of how a woman could live according to her own will, rather than society's expectations. One such relationship involved the Marquise de Florensac, a woman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence who had been married off at 16 to a much older nobleman whose primary interests were hunting and gambling. The Marquise possessed a brilliant mind and passionate nature that had been completely stifled by her conventional marriage, leaving her desperately unhappy despite her wealth and social position. Julie met the Marquise at a private performance given for a select group of aristocratic patrons, and their attraction was immediate and mutual. The Marquise was fascinated by Julie's combination of artistic achievement and personal freedom, while Julie was drawn to the older woman's sophistication and the tragic nobility of her constrained circumstances. Their affair was conducted with elaborate secrecy, requiring careful planning and constant vigilance to avoid detection by the Marquise's husband or the network of servants and social acquaintances who might report suspicious behavior. They met in safe houses provided by sympathetic friends, communicated through coded letters, and developed elaborate systems of signals and arrangements that allowed them to spend time together without arousing suspicion. The relationship provided both women with experiences and emotions that had been missing from their lives. For the Marquise, Julie represented the possibility of authentic love and genuine partnership that her marriage had never provided. For Julie, the Marquise offered intellectual stimulation and emotional depth that complemented her other relationships without replacing them. Their connection lasted for nearly 2 years, during which time both women took considerable risks to maintain their secret meetings and correspondence. The relationship eventually ended when the Marquise's husband became suspicious of her behavior and imposed restrictions on her movements that made further meetings impossible. Yet both women continued to regard their time together as among the most meaningful experiences of their lives. Another significant relationship during this period nearly resulted in another major scandal when Julie became involved with the daughter of a prominent duke. The young woman was intelligent, beautiful, and desperately unhappy with the prospect of an arranged marriage to a man she despised. Julie offered her not just romantic passion, but the possibility of a completely different kind of life, one based on personal choice rather than family obligation. The Duke's daughter, unlike some of Julie's other aristocratic lovers, was young and inexperienced enough to believe that love could overcome all obstacles. She began making increasingly careless statements about her desire to escape her family's plans for her future, hinting at her involvement with someone who could provide her with alternatives to conventional marriage. Their affair was conducted with great secrecy, but the intensity of their connection made discretion increasingly difficult. They exchanged passionate letters, met in secret locations, and began to plan a future together that would have required the young woman to abandon her family and social position entirely. The relationship reached a crisis point during a grand ball at the Duke's palace, where Julie appeared as an invited guest because of her celebrity status. The palace ball was one of the most elaborate social events of the season, attended by hundreds of the most influential people in French society. Julie's presence was both celebrated and controversial, as many guests were curious to meet the legendary woman whose adventures had made her famous throughout Europe. She was treated with the respect due to her artistic achievements, but also with the cautious fascination that people reserve for dangerous but compelling individuals. The evening began conventionally enough, with Julie performing for the assembled guests as was expected of celebrated artists at such gatherings. Her performance was flawless and received enthusiastic applause, but the real drama began after the formal entertainment ended and the guests began dancing and socializing more freely. But as the evening progressed and wine flowed freely, the carefully maintained boundaries between public performance and private passion began to blur. Julie and the Duke's daughter found themselves dancing together, their movements becoming increasingly intimate and obvious to the other guests. The situation reached its climax when Julie, perhaps emboldened by wine and the intensity of her feelings, publicly kissed the young woman in full view of the assembled company. The kiss was not a mere social gesture, but a passionate declaration that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The shocked silence that followed was broken only by the Duke's furious demands that Julie leave his house immediately. But Julie was not inclined to retreat quietly from a situation that she saw as involving her honor and the honor of someone she loved. When three young noblemen, perhaps seeking to impress the Duke or genuinely outraged by what they had witnessed, began making loud and insulting comments about Julie's behavior and character, she responded in the most direct way she knew. She challenged all three men to duels, an action that was unprecedented for a woman and shocking even by the relaxed standards of French dueling culture. The challenges were issued publicly, in front of witnesses, making it impossible for the men to refuse without appearing cowardly. Julie's reputation as a skilled swordswoman was well known, but many assumed that her abilities had been exaggerated for dramatic effect. The three noblemen who found themselves challenged were representative of the young aristocratic men who frequented the court and considered themselves accomplished in the arts of warfare and honor. They had received formal training in swordplay from the finest masters available, participated in numerous informal dueling encounters, and possessed the kind of arrogant confidence that came from never having faced a truly formidable opponent. Their initial reaction to Julie's challenge was amusement mixed with outrage at the presumption of a woman, even a celebrated one, daring to question their honor or skill. They assumed that they could either dismiss her challenge as the hysterical gesture of an emotional woman or accept it in the confidence that the encounter would be brief and decisive in their favor. The duels were arranged for the following morning in a secluded location outside Paris, where such affairs of honor were traditionally conducted. Julie arrived at dawn, impeccably dressed and carrying the same sword that had served her so well in her years of wandering performances. Her opponents, who had perhaps expected her to apologize or fail to appear, found themselves facing a woman whose calm confidence and obvious skill made it clear that this would be no mere theatrical gesture. The first duel was over quickly. Julie's opponent, despite his training in the fashionable sword work taught to young gentlemen, was no match for someone who had learned her skills in the harsh school of necessity and had continued to practice with deadly seriousness throughout her career. Within minutes, he was disarmed and bleeding from a precise wound to his sword arm, effectively ending his ability to continue fighting. The second gentleman, witnessing his friend's defeat, approached his own encounter with greater caution and respect for Julie's abilities. The fight lasted longer, with both participants demonstrating genuine skill, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Julie's combination of technical excellence, physical conditioning, and psychological advantage proved decisive, and her second opponent soon joined the first in defeat. The third duel was the most challenging, as her final opponent was an experienced duelist who had fought and won several previous encounters. He took Julie seriously from the beginning, employing all his skill and experience in an attempt to overcome what he clearly recognized as a formidable adversary. The fight was intense and prolonged, with both participants sustaining minor wounds before Julie finally achieved the decisive advantage that ended the encounter. When the morning's work was finished, three of France's supposedly finest young swordsmen had been defeated by a woman whose unconventional background had prepared her for exactly this kind of challenge. The news of the triple victory spread quickly through Parisian society, adding yet another dramatic chapter to Julie's already legendary reputation. The aftermath of the duels was complicated by the social and legal implications of what had occurred. Dueling, while common among gentlemen, was technically illegal, and the involvement of a woman in such affairs created unprecedented legal questions. However, Julie's position at the Paris Opera and her growing influence with powerful patrons provided her with protection from serious legal consequences. More significantly, the duels established Julie's reputation as someone who would defend her honor and that of those she loved with deadly force if necessary. This reputation, combined with her artistic achievements, created a unique position in French society where she could pursue her romantic inclinations with relative freedom from interference or criticism. Her relationship with the Duke's daughter, however, could not survive the scandal and family pressure that followed the evening's dramatic events. The young woman was quickly married off to a distant relative and removed from Parisian society, ending what might have been one of Julie's most significant romantic relationships. Yet Julie's capacity for love and her attraction to both conventional and unconventional partners continued to define much of her personal life. She formed relationships with fellow performers, aristocratic patrons, and interesting individuals from across the spectrum of French society. Each relationship was intense and meaningful in its own way, reflecting Julie's belief that authentic emotion and genuine connection were more important than social conventions or long-term stability. Her romantic adventures during this period became the subject of constant gossip and speculation among Parisian society, with each new affair adding to her legend and mystique. Yet those who knew her well understood that her multiple relationships were not the result of fickleness or inability to commit, but rather reflected her enormous capacity for love and her refusal to accept artificial limitations on human emotional experience. Her romantic life during this period was characterized by passion, honesty, and a refusal to accept the limitations that society attempted to place on women's emotional and sexual freedom. She loved whom she chose, when she chose, and with an intensity that was both inspiring and sometimes destructive to those who became involved with her. Through all these relationships, Julie maintained her independence and her commitment to her artistic career. Love was tremendously important to her, but it never became a substitute for her own achievements and ambitions. She remained someone who defined herself primarily through her own actions and accomplishments, rather than through her connections to others, no matter how meaningful those connections might be. This period of Julie's life demonstrated that it was possible for a woman of exceptional talent and determination to create her own rules for living, even in a society that offered women few opportunities for genuine independence. Her success at the Paris Opera had given her the platform she needed to live according to her own values, and she used that freedom to explore the full range of human emotional experience with characteristic courage and authenticity. Part 8. The Art of the Sword and Affairs of Honor. While Julie d'Aubigny's fame rested primarily on her extraordinary abilities as an opera singer, her equally remarkable skills as a swordswoman played a crucial role in defining her character and reputation throughout her career. In an age when the ability to defend one's honor with a blade was considered essential to maintaining respect in society, Julie's mastery of sword work gave her a unique position among the women of her time and allowed her to navigate conflicts that would have destroyed someone with less formidable abilities. Her sword work was not merely a curiosity or an amusing accomplishment, as it might have been for other women who learned basic fencing techniques. Julie's skills were developed to a level that rivaled or exceeded those of the finest gentlemen, swordsmen of her era. She approached sword work with the same intensity and dedication that she brought to her operatic performances, understanding that in her unconventional life, the ability to defend herself might be a matter of survival rather than mere honor. The foundation of her sword work had been laid during her childhood under her father's instruction, but those early lessons were refined and perfected through years of practice and real-world application. Unlike gentlemen who learned fencing in controlled academic settings, Julie's sword work was tested in actual confrontations where mistakes could have fatal consequences. This practical experience gave her techniques a efficiency and deadly effectiveness that purely academic training could never achieve. Her preferred weapon was the rapier, the gentleman's sword of choice in 17th century France. The rapier was a thrusting weapon that required exceptional precision, timing, and tactical understanding to use effectively. It was lighter than the older cutting swords but demanded greater skill to master, as successful technique depended more on finesse and intelligence than on brute strength. For Julie, who combined natural physical abilities with keen tactical intelligence, the rapier was an ideal weapon that allowed her to compete on equal terms with opponents who might have advantages in size or strength. The famous triple duel that followed her scandalous kiss at the Duke's ball was neither the first nor the last time Julie would use her sword to defend her honor or that of someone she cared about. Throughout her career, she was involved in numerous confrontations that were resolved through formal dueling, and her reputation as someone who would not hesitate to resort to the sword when insulted or challenged became an important part of her public persona. One of her most celebrated duels occurred when a rival opera singer, jealous of Julie's success and resentful of her unconventional background, made public statements questioning both her artistic abilities and her moral character. The insults were delivered at a gathering where many members of the opera community were present, making them impossible to ignore without appearing to accept their validity. Julie's response was swift and decisive. She challenged her rival to a duel, specifying that the encounter would be conducted according to the formal rules that govern such affairs among gentlemen. The challenge created a sensation in the opera world, as duels between performers were unusual and duels involving women were virtually unprecedented. The rival, who had apparently expected Julie to respond with tears or complaints to the opera management, found herself facing a situation she was completely unprepared for. She had no choice but to accept the challenge or face public humiliation for cowardice, but she also lacked any real skill with weapons that might give her a chance of success in the encounter. The duel itself was conducted with all the formal ceremony that tradition demanded, but the outcome was never in doubt. Julie's opponent was defeated quickly and decisively, sustaining wounds that were serious enough to end any further challenges to Julie's reputation while not being life-threatening. The encounter effectively ended the rivalry and established Julie's position in the opera company beyond any future question. But Julie's most remarkable sword work was often displayed in situations that had nothing to do with formal dueling. Her skills allowed her to move confidently through the dangerous areas of Paris and other cities where her artistic career took her, and she was known to have defended herself successfully against common criminals who mistook her for an easy target. One such incident occurred when Julie was returning late at night from a performance to her apartments in a fashionable district of Paris. She was followed by several men who apparently intended to rob her of the jewelry and money she was known to carry. When they confronted her in a narrow alley, expecting an easy victim, they instead found themselves facing someone whose sword was out and ready before they could complete their threats. The fight that followed was brutal and efficient. Julie's attackers were experienced in intimidating defenseless victims, but they had no training in facing a skilled swordsman who was perfectly willing to use deadly force to defend herself. Within minutes, 2 of the attackers were on the ground with serious wounds, and the third had fled into the darkness. Julie continued to her apartments, her clothing torn and bloodied, but her dignity and possessions intact. Word of such encounters spread quickly through Parisian society, adding to Julie's reputation as someone who lived by her own rules and was capable of enforcing those rules through force when necessary. This reputation served her well in many situations, as potential adversaries were forced to consider whether challenging her was worth the very real risk of finding themselves on the wrong end of her sword. Her sword work also influenced her stage performances in ways that audiences found thrilling and unprecedented. When she appeared in roles that required her to portray warriors or other characters who might reasonably be expected to handle weapons, her movements had an authenticity and conviction that no amount of theatrical training could simulate. She moved like someone who truly understood how to use a sword in combat, and this authenticity elevated her dramatic performances beyond mere acting into something approaching reality. The psychological aspects of Julie's sword work were as important as the physical techniques she had mastered. She understood that confidence and mental preparation were crucial elements in any confrontation, and she cultivated a presence that often intimidated opponents before any actual fighting began. Her reputation preceded her into most encounters, and many potential adversaries reconsidered their challenges when faced with someone whose skills were legendary throughout France. Yet Julie never used her abilities as a swordswoman to bully or intimidate those who were weaker than herself. Her duels and fights were always responses to genuine insults or threats, and she followed the codes of honor that governed such encounters among gentlemen. She was as scrupulous about the formal requirements of dueling as she was deadly in its execution. Her mastery of sword work represented more than just a practical skill. It was a symbol of her refusal to accept the limitations that society attempted to place on women's lives. In an age when women were expected to depend on men for protection, Julie had made herself capable of defending her own honor and safety. This independence was both inspiring to those who admired her and threatening to those who preferred women to remain dependent and controllable. The combination of artistic brilliance and martial prowess made Julie a unique figure in French society, someone who could command respect through multiple forms of excellence. She had proven that a woman could succeed in fields that were traditionally reserved for men, and she had done so without sacrificing her femininity or her artistic sensibilities. Her sword was as much a part of her identity as her voice, and both contributed to making her one of the most remarkable individuals of her extraordinary age. Part 9. Scandals and Conflicts with Authority. Julie d'Aubigny's refusal to conform to social expectations inevitably brought her into conflict with various forms of authority throughout her career, from church officials scandalized by her personal life to government representatives concerned about public order. Her ability to navigate these conflicts while maintaining her independence and continuing her artistic career demonstrated both her intelligence and her understanding of how power operated in 17th century French society. The most persistent source of conflict came from religious authorities who viewed Julie's lifestyle as a direct challenge to Christian morality and social order. Her open bisexuality, her involvement in dueling, and her general disregard for conventional feminine behavior made her a target for clergy who saw her influence as corrupting to society, particularly to young women who might be tempted to follow her example. Several prominent clerics delivered sermons that, while not mentioning Julie by name, clearly referenced her behavior as an example of the moral decay that they believed was threatening French society. These attacks were not merely theological disagreements, but represented genuine attempts to use religious authority to restrict Julie's freedom and career opportunities. The church's opposition became particularly intense following the convent burning incident, which was seen not just as a crime, but as a direct assault on religious institutions and values. Even after the legal charges were effectively dropped through royal intervention, church officials continued to view Julie as a dangerous enemy whose influence needed to be contained. Julie's response to religious criticism was characteristically direct and uncompromising. Rather than attempting to modify her behavior to appease her critics, she continued to live according to her own values while using her artistic platform to subtly challenge the moral authority of those who attacked her. Her performances often included interpretations of religious or mythological characters that emphasized themes of individual freedom and resistance to unjust authority. Government officials presented a more complex challenge, as they were often caught between their official responsibilities to maintain public order and their personal admiration for Julie's artistic achievements. Many members of the royal court were devoted fans of opera and recognized Julie as one of the greatest performers of her generation, making it difficult for them to take actions that might interfere with her career. However, Julie's involvement in numerous duels and public disturbances created ongoing problems for officials who were responsible for enforcing laws against such activities. Dueling was technically illegal, and Julie's participation in multiple such encounters made it difficult for authorities to ignore her violations, without appearing to apply different standards to celebrities than to ordinary citizens. The situation was further complicated by Julie's growing influence with powerful patrons, who were themselves connected to the highest levels of government. Her artistic achievements had earned her the protection of individuals who could intervene on her behalf when legal or political difficulties arose, creating a complex web of competing interests and obligations that officials had to navigate carefully. One of the most serious conflicts with authority occurred when Julie became involved in a dispute with the management of the Paris Opera over artistic and financial matters. The disagreement began over questions about her repertoire and performance schedule, but escalated into a broader conflict about the extent to which the opera company could control the personal lives and public behavior of its performers. Julie argued that her artistic excellence gave her the right to significant input into her roles and working conditions, a position that challenged the traditional hierarchical structure of the opera company. Management, while recognizing her value as a performer, was concerned about setting precedents that might lead other singers to make similar demands. The conflict reached a crisis point when opera management attempted to suspend Julie for missing performances, a punishment she felt was unjustified given her overall contribution to the company's success. Her response was to organize an informal strike among sympathetic performers, effectively shutting down productions until the dispute could be resolved. The strike demonstrated Julie's influence among her fellow performers and her ability to use collective action to achieve her goals. It also showed her understanding of how artistic institutions operated and her willingness to challenge authority, even when doing so, involved significant risk to her own career. The resolution of the opera dispute required intervention from the highest levels of French cultural administration, including officials who reported directly to the king. The settlement that was eventually reached gave Julie many of the concessions she had sought while allowing opera management to maintain face, by characterizing the agreement as a special recognition of her unique contributions rather than a surrender to performer demands. But perhaps Julie's most significant conflict with authority involved her ongoing legal status related to the convent burning incident. Although the death sentence had been effectively nullified through royal intervention, she technically remained an outlaw who could theoretically be arrested and executed if circumstances changed or if her powerful protectors decided to withdraw their support. This precarious legal situation created ongoing tension in Julie's life, as she had to be constantly aware of political developments that might affect her safety. Changes in government personnel, shifts in royal favor, or new religious campaigns against moral corruption could potentially revive interest in prosecuting her for her earlier crimes. Julie managed this uncertainty by maintaining careful relationships with multiple sources of protection, while avoiding any actions that might provide her enemies with new ammunition to use against her. She had to balance her natural inclination toward dramatic gesture and public controversy with the practical necessity of not attracting unwanted official attention. The skill with which she navigated these various conflicts with authority demonstrated Julie's intelligence and political acumen. She understood that her position in society, while unique and privileged in many ways, was also precarious and dependent on maintaining the support of influential patrons who could protect her from those who sought to restrict her freedom. Her success in avoiding serious legal consequences while continuing to live according to her own values showed that it was possible, with sufficient talent and careful strategy, for even someone as unconventional as Julie to find ways to thrive within the constraints of 17th century French society. She had learned to use her artistic achievements as both a shield against criticism and a platform from which to influence social attitudes about women's capabilities and rights. Through all these conflicts, Julie never lost sight of her primary identity as an artist whose ultimate goal was to create memorable and meaningful performances for audiences who appreciated her unique talents. Her battles with authority were not attempts to destroy existing institutions, but efforts to create space within those institutions for individuals whose talents and inclinations did not fit conventional patterns. Her example demonstrated that genuine artistic excellence could sometimes transcend social prejudices and legal restrictions, creating opportunities for extraordinary individuals to make their own rules while still participating in the broader cultural life of their society. She had become living proof that the boundaries society placed on individual behavior were not as fixed or insurmountable as they often appeared to be. Part 10. The Mysterious Final Years. As Julie d'Aubigny entered what would prove to be the final phase of her extraordinary life, her public persona began to undergo a transformation that puzzled contemporaries and continues to intrigue historians today. The woman who had built her reputation on dramatic gestures, passionate affairs, and public confrontations gradually withdrew from the spotlight that had defined her adult existence, leaving behind tantalizing hints about her motivations and ultimate fate. The beginning of this final period can be traced to around 1705, when Julie was in her mid-30s and at the height of her artistic powers. Her performances at the Paris Opera continued to draw enthusiastic audiences, and her technical abilities as a singer had reached a level of maturity and sophistication that even her critics had to acknowledge. Yet those closest to her began to notice subtle changes in her behavior and attitudes that suggested a fundamental shift in her approach to life. The first sign of this transformation was Julie's gradual reduction in the number of public appearances and social engagements that had previously filled her schedule. While she continued to fulfill her professional obligations at the opera, she began declining invitations to the parties, salons, and court functions where she had once been a celebrated and controversial presence. Friends and acquaintances noted that she seemed increasingly interested in solitude and contemplation, rather than the social whirlwind that had characterized her earlier years. This withdrawal from public life was accompanied by changes in Julie's romantic relationships that were equally surprising to those who knew her well. The passionate affairs that had provided much of the drama and scandal of her earlier years became less frequent and less intense. She seemed to be seeking deeper, more meaningful connections, rather than the exciting but often temporary relationships that had defined her love life throughout her 20s and early 30s. Some observers speculated that Julie was simply maturing, that the intensity and drama of her earlier years had naturally given way to a more settled and reflective approach to life. Others suggested that the constant stress of maintaining her unique position in society, while dealing with ongoing legal and social pressures, had finally begun to take a toll on her physical and emotional well-being. During this period, Julie began to show increased interest in religious and philosophical questions that had previously seemed irrelevant to her intensely secular lifestyle. She was observed visiting churches not for social occasions, but apparently for private prayer and contemplation. She began reading theological and philosophical works, engaging in conversations about spiritual matters with individuals known for their religious devotion. This spiritual awakening, if that is what it was, represented a dramatic departure from the materialism and sensual pleasure-seeking that had characterized much of Julie's adult life. The woman who had once burned down a convent to rescue a lover was now apparently seeking answers to questions about the meaning and purpose of human existence that transcended immediate physical and emotional gratification. Her artistic performances during this period reflected these internal changes in subtle but noticeable ways. While her technical abilities remained as impressive as ever, critics and audiences noted a new depth and emotional complexity in her interpretations of operatic roles. She seemed to bring a more mature understanding of human suffering and redemption to characters that she had previously portrayed with brilliant but perhaps more superficial effectiveness. The roles she chose to perform also shifted during these final years, with Julie showing increased interest in characters who underwent spiritual transformations or who struggled with questions of moral responsibility and divine purpose. Her interpretation of these roles was informed by what appeared to be genuine personal engagement with the spiritual themes they explored. As 1706 progressed, Julie's withdrawal from public life became more pronounced. She began missing performances at the Paris Opera, initially due to claimed illness, but eventually without any explanation at all. Her apartments, which had once been gathering places for artists, intellectuals, and aristocrats, became quiet and were visited only by a small number of close friends who were sworn to discretion about what they observed there. Rumors began to circulate about Julie's intentions and state of mind. Some suggested that she was planning to leave France entirely, perhaps to start a new life in a country where her past would not be known. Others speculated that she was suffering from a serious illness that she was attempting to conceal from the public. Still others whispered that she was planning to follow the example of other famous women who had ended their worldly careers by entering religious life. The truth about Julie's final plans began to emerge in early 1707, when it became known that she had been in communication with religious authorities about the possibility of entering a convent. The irony of this development was not lost on anyone familiar with her earlier, dramatic rescue of a lover from just such an institution. The woman who had once viewed convents as prisons was now apparently considering one as a refuge. The negotiations regarding her potential entry into religious life were complex and delicate. Church authorities were understandably skeptical about the sincerity of a conversion by someone whose entire adult life had been spent in apparent defiance of Christian moral teachings. They required extensive evidence of genuine repentance and spiritual commitment before they would consider accepting someone with Julie's notorious reputation. Julie appeared to approach these requirements with the same seriousness and determination that she had brought to mastering opera and sword work. She engaged in extended theological discussions with experienced clerics, demonstrated knowledge of religious texts and practices, and showed what appeared to be genuine commitment to the spiritual disciplines that religious life would require. The convent that eventually agreed to accept her was located in Avignon, far from the Paris opera world where she had achieved her greatest triumphs. The convent of the Visitation was known for accepting women who sought to make dramatic changes in their lives, and the sisters there had experience in helping former courtesans and other women with unconventional backgrounds transition to religious life. Julie's decision to enter the convent was kept secret from all but her closest associates until the arrangements were complete. When she finally departed from Paris in the spring of 1707, it was quietly and without the dramatic gestures that had characterized most of the major transitions in her life. She simply disappeared from the world she had dominated for over a decade, leaving behind only questions about her motivations and speculation about her future. The reasons for Julie's dramatic life change remained a mystery that she apparently never explained fully to anyone. Some who knew her well believed that she had experienced a genuine religious conversion, perhaps triggered by contemplation of her own mortality or by guilt over some of the more destructive consequences of her unconventional lifestyle. Others suggested that she was simply exhausted by the constant struggle to maintain her unique position in society and sought the peace and security that religious life might provide. Her entrance into the convent of the Visitation in Avignon marked the end of one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of French culture. The woman who had revolutionized opera performance, challenged social conventions about women's capabilities, and lived more dramatically than most people could imagine, had chosen to spend her final months in prayer, contemplation, and service to others. Part 11. Death and Immediate Legacy. The final chapter of Julie d'Aubigny's remarkable life unfolded in the quiet corridors of the convent of the Visitation in Avignon, a setting so different from the glittering stages and dangerous dueling grounds where she had made her name that it seemed to represent a complete transformation of everything she had once been. Yet even in this setting of prayer and contemplation, Julie remained a figure of mystery and fascination, whose every action was scrutinized for clues about her motivations and state of mind. Her life within the convent walls was initially marked by the same intensity and dedication that had characterized all her previous endeavors. She threw herself into the religious disciplines of prayer, meditation, and service, with the thoroughness that had once made her the finest opera singer in France. The sisters who supervised her spiritual development noted her intelligence, her apparent sincere devotion, and her willingness to perform even the most humble tasks required of novices. Yet those who observed Julie closely during this period also noted that she remained essentially herself, despite the dramatic change in her circumstances. Her natural charisma and force of personality could not be entirely suppressed by religious discipline, and she quickly became an influential figure among the other women in the convent. Her past experiences and worldly knowledge made her a source of advice and guidance for sisters who had lived much more sheltered lives. The question of whether Julie's conversion was genuine or simply a calculated retreat from a life that had become too complicated and dangerous was debated among those who knew her, and it remains a subject of historical speculation today. What is clear is that she approached religious life with characteristic seriousness, and that her presence in the convent was transformative for the institution and the women who lived there. Her death came with shocking suddenness in the late summer of 1707, after she had been in the convent for only a few months. The official cause was given as fever, a common killer in an age before modern medicine. But the rapidity of her decline and the circumstances surrounding her final illness raised questions that were never satisfactorily answered. Some of those present during her final days reported that Julie seemed to have a premonition of her approaching death, speaking with unusual urgency about matters she wanted to resolve and messages she wanted conveyed to people from her former life. Others noted that despite her physical weakness, her mind remained sharp and her personality unchanged until the very end. The mystery surrounding Julie's death was deepened by the fact that she was only 37 years old and had shown no signs of serious illness before her final rapid decline. Various theories were proposed to explain her sudden death, ranging from natural disease to suicide, to murder by enemies who had finally found a way to reach her, despite her religious sanctuary. The suicide theory was based partly on speculation that Julie had become deeply depressed by the contrast between her current restricted life and the freedom and excitement she had once enjoyed. Supporters of this theory suggested that she might have taken poison or somehow otherwise hastened her own death, rather than continuing to live in a manner so completely opposed to her natural temperament. The murder theory, while more dramatic, was not entirely implausible given the number of enemies Julie had made during her unconventional career. Her various legal troubles, romantic scandals, and dueling victories had created a substantial list of individuals who might have wished her harm. The convent, despite its spiritual purpose, was not impregnable to someone with sufficient motivation and resources to reach a person living within its walls. However, the most likely explanation for Julie's death was simply the fever that was officially recorded as the cause. The 17th century was a dangerous time for anyone's health, and even strong, healthy individuals could be struck down quickly by diseases that would be easily treatable today. Julie's dramatic lifestyle might have weakened her constitution in ways that made her more vulnerable to illness than she appeared to be. News of Julie's death spread quickly through the networks of artists, aristocrats, and cultural enthusiasts who had followed her career. The reaction was a mixture of shock, sadness, and a sense that something irreplaceable had been lost from French cultural life. Even those who had disapproved of her lifestyle acknowledged that her artistic achievements had been extraordinary and that her death marked the end of an era. The immediate legacy of Julie's life was complex and sometimes contradictory. To some, she represented the dangers of allowing women too much freedom and independence, and her ultimate retreat to a convent was seen as evidence that even the most rebellious women eventually recognized the wisdom of traditional religious and social constraints. To others, Julie's life demonstrated that women could achieve excellence in fields traditionally reserved for men, and that social conventions were not as immutable as they were often portrayed to be. Her success as both an opera singer and a swordswoman showed that gender roles were more flexible than most people assumed, and that individual talent and determination could overcome even the most entrenched prejudices. Her influence on the opera world was immediate and lasting. The performance standards she had established and the dramatic intensity she had brought to operatic roles influenced a generation of singers who attempted to emulate her achievements. Her approach to combining vocal technique with dramatic truth became a model that shaped the development of opera as an art form. The dueling world, too, felt the impact of Julie's career. Her success in formal combat with some of France's finest swordsmen challenged assumptions about women's physical capabilities and established precedents that would be cited by other women who sought to defend their honor through force of arms. Perhaps most importantly, Julie's life had demonstrated that it was possible for an individual of exceptional talent and determination to create their own rules for living, even in a society that offered limited opportunities for unconventional behavior. She had shown that the boundaries placed on individual freedom were not as absolute as they appeared, and that courage and skill could sometimes overcome even the most determined opposition. Her death at such a young age meant that many questions about her ultimate potential and the full extent of her influence would never be answered. What additional artistic achievements might she have accomplished? How might her example have influenced other women seeking to expand their opportunities and freedom? What might her mature reflections on her extraordinary life have contributed to understanding of human possibility and limitation? These questions remained unanswered, but the life she had already lived provided inspiration and example enough for generations of individuals who refused to accept that their circumstances of birth or social position should determine the limits of their achievements and aspirations. Part 12. Enduring Influence and Modern Relevance. Julie d'Aubigny's death in 1707 might have marked the end of her personal story, but it was far from the end of her influence on culture, society, and individual imagination. In the centuries that followed her passing, her remarkable life continued to inspire, challenge, and fascinate people across different eras and cultures, evolving from historical fact into legend, and from legend into symbol of human possibility and rebellion against constraint. The immediate aftermath of her death saw the beginning of a process by which Julie's story was gradually transformed from contemporary scandal into romantic legend. Writers, poets, and storytellers began to embellish and reshape the facts of her life, adding dramatic details that seem consistent with her character, while sometimes obscuring the actual historical record. This process of mythologization was both inevitable and appropriate, as Julie's real life had been so extraordinary that it seemed to demand artistic interpretation and enhancement. During the 18th century, as Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge traditional assumptions about human nature and social organization, Julie's story found new relevance as an example of individual potential transcending social limitations. Philosophers and social critics, who argued for expanded rights and opportunities for women, often cited her achievements as evidence that gender roles were culturally constructed rather than naturally determined. The Romantic movement of the early 19th century embraced Julie as a perfect embodiment of their ideals about passionate individualism and artistic authenticity. Romantic writers and artists were fascinated by her combination of artistic genius and personal rebellion, seeing in her life a model of how creative individuals might resist the conformist pressures of conventional society. Her willingness to risk everything for love and honor resonated strongly with romantic sensibilities about the supremacy of emotion over social convention. As women's rights movements developed throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Julie's story took on new political significance as an example of what women could achieve when freed from traditional restrictions. Suffragists and feminists pointed to her success in opera and swordwork as evidence that women's supposed intellectual and physical limitations were actually the result of social oppression rather than natural incapacity. The sexual revolution of the mid-20th century brought yet another dimension to appreciation of Julie's legacy, as her open bisexuality and refusal to conform to conventional moral standards seemed to anticipate modern attitudes about sexual freedom and personal choice. LGBTQ+ activists and scholars began to recognize her as an early example of someone who lived authentically according to their sexual orientation, despite intense social pressure to conform to heterosexual norms. Modern opera companies and music historians have worked to separate the facts of Julie's artistic achievements from the legends that have grown up around her personal life, revealing a performer whose technical innovations and dramatic interpretations influenced the development of opera as an art form in ways that are still appreciated today. Her approach to combining vocal excellence with dramatic truth established standards that continue to influence operatic performance. Contemporary feminists have found in Julie's story both inspiration and complex challenges to simple narratives about women's empowerment. Her achievements demonstrate the possibility of female excellence in traditionally male-dominated fields. But her ultimate retreat to a convent raises questions about the psychological costs of constantly fighting against social expectations and the sustainability of complete individual rebellion. The modern understanding of Julie's life has been enriched by scholarly research that has separated historical fact from romantic embellishment while maintaining appreciation for the genuinely extraordinary nature of her achievements. Historians have documented the specific social and cultural context that made her career possible, while acknowledging the unique combination of talent, courage, and circumstances that allowed her to transcend the limitations of her era. Her story continues to inspire creative works across various media, from novels and plays to films and operas, that attempt to capture both the drama of her life and the broader themes it represents. These artistic interpretations often say as much about contemporary values and concerns as they do about 17th century France, demonstrating the continuing relevance of Julie's example to questions about individual freedom, artistic integrity, and social change. In our current era of ongoing struggles for gender equality and LGBTQ+ rights, Julie's life offers both historical perspective and contemporary relevance. Her achievements remind us that the limitations placed on individual potential by social prejudice are not natural or inevitable, and that exceptional individuals have always found ways to transcend the constraints of their times. Her example also illustrates the costs and challenges involved in living authentically when that authenticity conflicts with social expectations. Julie's life was marked by constant struggle, legal difficulties, and ultimately early death, suggesting that individual rebellion, however admirable, often comes with significant personal costs that should not be minimized or romanticized. The complexity of Julie's legacy reflects the complexity of her life and character. She was neither a perfect feminist role model nor a simple rebel without cause, but rather a fully human individual whose extraordinary talents and fierce independence created both magnificent achievements and serious problems. Her life demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of individual action in creating social change. Perhaps most importantly, Julie d'Aubigny's story continues to challenge us to examine our own assumptions about what is possible for human achievement and self-expression. Her life shows that the boundaries society places on individual behavior are often more flexible than they appear, and that courage, talent, and determination can sometimes overcome even the most entrenched opposition. Her legacy reminds us that every generation produces individuals whose potential transcends the limitations of their historical moment, and that recognizing and supporting such individuals is crucial to the ongoing development of human culture and possibility. Julie's story encourages us to question our own assumptions about what people can achieve and to support those whose talents and inclinations challenge conventional expectations. In an age when questions about gender roles, sexual identity, and individual freedom remain contentious and unresolved, Julie d'Aubigny's 17th-century example continues to offer both inspiration and instruction. Her life demonstrates that the struggle for authentic self-expression and recognition of human potential is not a modern invention, but a recurring theme in human history that connects us across centuries and cultures. Her extraordinary journey from minor nobility to international celebrity to religious recluse to enduring legend illustrates the unpredictable and fascinating possibilities inherent in human existence. Julie d'Aubigny lived a life that was larger than the times that contained it, and her story continues to expand our understanding of what it means to be fully and authentically human in any era.